All right, welcome back. So this next segment for Module 2, we're going to talk about query by example. And so what query by example, or QBE, what this is just kind of a formatted question that we're going to send to the database, essentially. So we're going to request some information from the database, and it's going to be formatted in a structure that the databases can understand. But the really nice thing about QBE is that it is a visual query. So we don't have to worry about knowing SQL or writing code or anything like that, at least at this point. So it is a visual query done through the graphical user interface, and we'll take a look at that here in a second within Access. And so there's when we have a query within Access, there's kind of two parts to it. And so the upper field kind of lists out all of the attributes or the column names for our tables. And then the lower panel is kind of a grid that lists out what we're going to request, right? So if I drag this over here, so this is what it looks like in Access. So I'm designing a query by example here. And we can see in the upper portion here we have our table, and then we have the associated attributes or the column names for those tables. And then down here in this design grid is the fields, the columns that we want to return from our query, right? So when we're querying our database, when we're requesting information, we don't have to get back all of the columns for that table. There are going to be times where we only want specific pieces of information, and so that's what we do down here in this grid, and that's how we kind of design our query. And so we can do that by simply kind of clicking on our column name here and then just dragging it down into the design grid. And there you can see it shows us what table it's from. It shows us that field, that column name. We can also add in a sort function if we want to sort the results by ascending or descending. And then we can also add in additional criteria. In the SAM project, right, we actually use is null, right? And so we can add in that criteria right there if we wish to. So I'll delete that. We also have our show checkboxes, right? It's automatically checked when I add in the column name to the design grid, because obviously they're assuming that if you're adding it that you want it to show in the results, right? But if you're using a pre-existing query, right, then maybe you want to change it and not show that column, so you can just uncheck it and things like that. So that is the basics of the query design, query by example. So I kind of had a pre-existing one there open. So let's look at kind of how we can create our own. So I'll just close out that one. I won't save it, right? So in Access here, we are in Access. We don't have anything open at the moment. If we just come up to Create, and then underneath the Query section, we got Query Design. And there's going to open up that window that we were just looking at. So I had the clients table here in the upper panel. So in order to add in tables into that field, that view, all we need to do is just come here on the right hand side where we have our Add Tables dialog box open, click on the table that we want to add, and then just simply add selected tables. And there we can see that it shows up, and then it looks just like what I had open just a second ago. So that's how easy it is to create a query by example. And again, it's all through the graphical user interface. We don't have to worry about coding anything, using SQL language or anything like that. So that's pretty great. So there's all that. Yep. Creating a new one. Perfect. Yeah, there's a screenshot, a little more detail about that query design. I've kind of mentioned most of those things there. But so there's a a few additional details there, so that's pretty great. So when we're creating our queries and we're in Access, the view that we were just looking at was the design view. Another common view that you're going to use with those QBEs is the datasheet view. And so, a lot of the times people, when they're building queries, especially if they're complex ones, will kind of switch back and forth between the datasheet view and the design view just to see what the results look like as they're building the query. And so when we build these queries, we're not creating like additional copies of the data or anything like that. We're still referencing all of the data that's stored in our database, but we're just selecting specific data from it. So we're not copying anything or creating additional data or anything like that. When we are in our datasheet view, meaning that we're seeing the results of our query, we are able to add and remove records from that view. So let's kind of take a look at that. So here's my query. Again, if I need to add a table, just select it there. If I need to remove a table, I can just right click on it and then remove table. So let's add in the column client ID. So before I dragged and dropped it into the column, you can also just double click. So we'll include those three columns: client ID, client name, and government. So now we can either select run, and that will run the query and give us our results, or we can just switch our view to datasheet view and it will do the same thing. So I'll just run it really quickly. And so here we are in the datasheet view. And so these are the results of our query, right? We've included the client ID, the client name, and the government, right? So if I look under my views here, we can see that it already selected datasheet view because these are the results of my query. I can easily switch back and forth to the design view, back to the datasheet view, and things like that. So I can kind of edit my query as needed while looking at the results and looking at what it's going to look like when I run the query. So that's really helpful. And so in the datasheet view, we can kind of see down here our records. We're on 1 of 24, and we can see this button here. I can insert a new record if I need to with a blank, blank record, and then fill in the information as needed. So that's query by example. Very easy to kind of create, all using the graphical user interface. And again, all it is just a way for us to retrieve information from our database, retrieve specific sets of information, not all of the data inside of our database. And so I mentioned, it's through the GUI. We don't have to worry about using code or SQL language, SQL, things like that. But if you wanted to see it inside that view, that third view is the SQL view. And so there you can kind of see what that SQL language actually looks like. Right? So we're selecting our table.column, and then we're selecting those specific columns from the table, right? So we talked a little bit before about how when we specify the table.column, that's kind of qualifying the column ID, right? Just making it very specific. So we're selecting those columns from that table, and then later on we'll learn more about, when we actually get into learning SQL language, we'll learn more about how we can, kind of put in different comparisons and operators and things like that to select even more specific sets of data and really fine-tune our query. But we'll get into that much later. So there's that query by example. You guys will get familiar with it. I hope this has been beneficial to you, and we'll see you in the next segment.